Hello, everybody. This is Let's Study, new edition of Let's Study, and this is SquareSoft, now Square Enix's uh, Japanese RPG Final Fantasy VII from around 1997. This is a game that has a large culture surrounding it, uh, both positive, and then there's the negative backlash type stuff. Um, as a reminder on Let's Study, we're as a general rule, looking at games in the context of themselves and not looking at their greater cultural influence or sort of community outside factors and that kind of thing. So, all the stuff surrounding this game is not particularly relevant to our study here. So, things that are engaged in, based in nostalgia, things that are based in sort of you had to be there or marketing or sales figures. All that stuff is not relevant to our purposes, and we're looking at this game as we do almost everything on Let's Study as an exercise almost completely academically. So, taking a look at Final Fantasy VII, to start with, here you can see um, the opening shots of the game. Final Fantasy VI, I believe, ended um, with a camera going through deep space, and Final Fantasy VII begins with a camera also in space, but sort of searching, as if it's sort of looking for a story to tell, as well as beginning with some contrast. It's almost an overture to set some sort of tension to get the player's attention before the game properly begins. And it also enforces themes that come about later involving space and the universe and sort of the unification of life. So moving ahead a little bit here, the game has began with a focus on Eris Gainsborough, who is now a very famous character in gaming, and for good reason. And then it has a pull out to show the entire world that we're currently inhabiting, displaying the title, and then zooming back into another specific point. This is a really efficient, great way of demonstrating a size of the world that the player is in. It's extremely fast, it's extremely efficient, and the player gains control of the character within a minute or two of the game first beginning. It doesn't tell you too much, it gives you some things to focus on, and it's basically a very, very efficient way of starting the game, introducing a world, but doing it through just demonstrating visuals as opposed to explaining things. Of course, now we reach a point. The next thing we see before the player gains control is a train, which is a recurring symbol throughout the game. And the first lines are spoke by this character, Barrett, who says, "Come on, newcomer, follow me." That is a very subtle way of tutorializing. Um, it tells the player exactly what they're supposed to do. It gives them an objective, just like this camera pan does. Uh, Demonstrating your goal just through a simple camera pan is very, very efficient. The newcomer follow me line is a great way to immerse the player character in Cloud's shoes immediately. Barrett is not just within the world talking to Cloud here, he's also talking to you, the player, directly. And that's a great, very simple way of doing what, in general, games should be doing in forcing a connection between player character and the actual person holding the controller and so forth. So, what is Final Fantasy about? The general story of the game is you come in here and you are playing as Cloud Strife, who is a mercenary with a very not subtle last name, who is for money assisting this eco-terrorism group with the destruction of a large mega corporation's facility, one of their many facilities, and the from the perspective of the environmental terrorism group led by Barrett here, as he explains here, there is a definitive problem with this sustainability of what this mega corporation is doing to the natural world. Uh, as is typical, they are blindly sacrificing the greater good of a large number of the planet's inhabitants and of the sustainability of the world in order to turn a profit in sort of short-sighted capitalist fashion. Now, going out of bounds here a little bit, 1997, it should note, it's obviously debates and discussions surrounding environmentalism. 1997 does not predate that. That's been going on for as long as technology has sort of been running parallel to the natural world's health or what have you. However, it does predate, I think, a lot of the environmentalism that we sort of accept as part of mainstream discussion and sort of worldwide crises that are now much easier to see or talk about. It certainly doesn't predate recycling or anything like that, but it predates Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. I think it predates a lot of the mainstream discussion on climate change and things like that. So the internet was just coming into its own at the time of Final Fantasy VII's release. So it sort of got in with these issues before everybody else really had a chance to accept them as part of life. And I think it's somewhat prophetic in that way, even if that's just a sort of product of timing and placement. So here we get the first inclination that there's more going on to this story than meets the eye. Our protagonist, Cloud, here has a bit of a mental moment, I believe, where he's having some sort of mental attack, some sort of flashback that he doesn't readily understand, which adds sort of the promise of additional layers to the story. This area also, this reactor, as it were, this structure, has places where the items are placed in plain sight for the player to pick up, which is a good way to tell the player that they need to be looking for items or that there are explorative elements to this game and this story. So, what kind of world are we living in Final Fantasy VII? I don't know that it's possible only once or twice the planet they're actually on is addressed as a specific name. It's usually just translated as the planet or whatever. What we have is a story and a world that run parallel to each other in terms of what I like to call blooming. And what I mean by that is, just like the initial camera sequence that is focused on Aerith Gainsborough and pulls out to reveal a bigger world, the game does that both in your progression of exploring this world, as well as expounding on the greater plots of the game. You begin the game in this city, in this very large, very hyper-industrialized, very smoggy city of Midgar. And as the game progresses, you slowly come to realize it's revealed that this is just one place in a bigger world. And then when you leave Midgar, you much more appreciate how large this world could be. It gives you a sense of bigness, even when it's not necessarily physically a bigger world. And this is something I'm going to talk about again and again in these Let's Studies, is it's more important for a world to feel big than to be big. A game such as like let's say Skyrim, which is a very large world. Conceptually, Skyrim is a one province of a much larger planet or plane of existence or continent or whatever, and Skyrim is just one thing. Now, physically within the game, you can go physically a lot of places. It may be many miles even, in as so far as you can convert an in-game world to real-world distance. However, in Final Fantasy VII, Midgar feels as big or bigger than that entire world, even though there aren't that many areas to go to, and that's because of the atmosphere. It's a smoke and mirrors effect, but it's very effective. Having your team be physically small within a larger world with high ceilings, with complex structures, it allows you to feel like you're in a game that's much bigger physically than it actually is. And this game does that very, very, very well. So here we have a time-based thing. This is another way to create tension after the first boss is defeated. Cloud and Barrett leave, and it's an escape sequence. It's not terribly difficult to complete, but upon first playthrough, you're certainly unaware of that, and that creates a great way of raising tension. The first chapter, you could say, of this story would involve the prologue sequence, the brief intro, zoom out and zoom in, Cloud and Barrett getting off the train for this assault, and then we have a very, very literal climax here with the reactor they're in exploding. It's a wonderful release of tension in this first chapter of the game. Creating mounting tension and then releasing it is something a lot of games aren't terribly good at from a beginning to end in an overall standpoint, and I would say Final Fantasy VII manages to do a masterful job of it, even just in the first 10 minutes or so. So let's talk a little bit about character and immersing a human player, the person holding the controller, with the protagonist that they are supposed to most relate to in a video game experience, in this case, Cloud. In the beginning of this game, Cloud is not invested. The same way that a human being picks up a book or starts to watch the first 3 minutes of a movie, or any other medium you're cold to, there's a certain cold period where you are removing yourself from your reality to become immersed in this form of entertainment, this experience. And it takes a few minutes or it takes a little bit of time in order to get invested. Final Fantasy VII very cleverly uses this tendency to help immerse you and get you invested in the role of Cloud himself. How does it do that? It does that by having Cloud initially not care about what these eco-terrorists, this group, are doing. He doesn't care. He's in this for the money. It makes no difference from him. He does not care. And accordingly, the player should not care. You don't know who these people are. You're extremely cold to this world. And this is a great and subtle way of getting you invested in Cloud by having you relate to him right from the beginning of the game. To have his emotional investment in this be as non-existent as yours is. So after they leave the reactor, we get a little bit more of this world. This game does a good job of not having you forget things too much. This is where we get our second appearance of Eris after the intro. And a lot of games, I think, take for granted your ability to remember certain aspects so that you can tie stories together and things like that. By having Eris appear here so soon after the intro scene, they're not allowing you to forget what's obviously something important to them in terms of relaying the story. You also get dialogue options here, which for the time, we take it for granted now, but at the time, being allowed to define your character through choice, direct choices, having them say one option or another, having her um, elect to do one thing over another, like as we see here, where Cloud can choose to fight these soldiers or to leave and escape. Um, this is another great way to define a character that we didn't really have a lot of before this game, outside of sort of dense, I guess, PC gaming situations. And then we see another instance of the train. The train being, uh, again, a very important symbol that I think I'll talk about length with here in a little bit. So let's talk about the greater plot. We've had basically we've summed up the plot of the first episode, the first chapter of the Final Fantasy VII story here with this reactor. What is the greater story? Where does this eventually go? And obviously, if you're watching this, again, the game's 20 years old and has some of the most famous scenes and characters in gaming at this point. I don't think a spoiler warning should be anything other than implicit, but for what it's worth, spoilers ahead. Cloud becomes more personally invested in this struggle to save the planet these characters inhabit, and also becomes more learned about the nature of these things. But ultimately, what defines his investment is love and a bond with other people on a more personal and more deeply affectionate level. This is a really clever way for a game to get you much more invested and to demonstrate the character's investment by demonstrating these connections between the greater world and the things that you can be tangibly invested in. We see this, we deal with this phenomenon all the time. The news, media, whatever, we see there is no day, no minute in our lives where there isn't someone that is radically struggling, war, tragedy, natural disasters. This is always happening, but as long as it's not in our backyard, there are limitations depending on who we are personally in how much we can be invested or how much we are able to sort of shed a tear, as it were, for these sorts of things. It's only when it's in our backyard that we struggle with that. If you watch an event, let's say an earthquake, a tsunami, some sort of natural disaster that demonstrates the death of 1,000 people, 2,000, 10,000, a September 11th, a large human dramatic tragedy such as these things, most people will feel something. They'll have some understanding of what has occurred and why it's a bad thing, why it's a sad thing. What they will not experience is something as deep and personally harmful as losing one person that you're deeply connected with, a partner, a sibling, a young person that you know, a friend, a parent, whatever. These situations mean less to the world at large, but they mean more to you personally. And that's something this game does. Cloud is unable to be invested in the greater fate of the world until people he cares about are tossed into the mix. They give him a tangible reason to care. And that's extended to the player, and it's very clever storytelling. It works a lot better than simply telling the player that this is your girlfriend or boyfriend and they have been kidnapped. That's just telling you what to do. That's not a great way to engage the player. And Final Fantasy VII does a much better job of keeping it engaged that way. So here is a very important exchange between Barrett and Cloud, where they're talking about the literal visualization of the class system in this city in Midgar. Midgar consists of 8 sections, each with a top or bottom, and there is very little middle ground. There is the people on the top ground, the top plate, as it were, are affluent and work for the mega corporation, and the people underneath have to dwell in slums. They're unemployed, and they're breathing in the toxic air and things that the manufacturing on the top plate are injecting down into them. And they have a brief exchange about if it sucks down there, why don't they move? Why don't they simply leave the place that is underprivileged and that's killing them? And Barrett demonstrates that basically Cloud and Barrett demonstrate a consensus that they cannot. Their place in life doesn't allow them to. Whether they can't get a job or it's because they love their home, no matter how badly it's suffering, that is their place in life, and it's just not that easy. And Cloud makes a remark that it's just like the train they're on. It can't go anywhere except for where its rails take it, which is, in Japan especially, and in urban areas around the world, trains are very symbolic of our predestinations in life. It's what we take to work every day. It's the track we're on. It's our predestination. And in this game, coming from Japan, in a place like Tokyo, especially in large cities there where trains are a large part of life, it makes for a very, very great metaphor that I really don't see a lot of people talking about or noticing, and I think it's very efficient and very clever storytelling. And we'll see that come into play a little later, both in foreshadowing as well as developing plot events. So this is Tifa. She's a childhood friend of Cloud's, and this is one of the characters, as we mentioned earlier, that gets Cloud personally invested. The planet is suddenly important to him because Tifa is important to him. He also gets the choice here. If you buy a flower from Eris earlier, you can give it to Tifa or Barrett's adopted daughter Marlene here. And this is a great way of demonstrating a very primitive, but I think very important and very seminal romance mechanic. Even today, the Mass Effect series, and as well as BioWare in general, has branched it out to some degree, but The Witcher 3 only really has a few different romance options. Romance being shorthand for the character you allow your character to become romantically involved when in the story, and you have some say over that. This game did this about the same 20 years ago. Romance systems in these, at least as far as I know, did not really exist in the form they exist now before this game. So I really think that's a mechanic that modern players very much enjoy. And this game did a great job of demonstrating that you could have such a mechanic even in a relatively primitive structure. I frequently see graphics as the primary reason many modern players can't engage with this game. I don't want to spend too much time on that again, because that's sort of operating on the outside influences as opposed to just looking at it in a vacuum. But since we are looking at it, and graphics are what we look at, we can touch on it a little bit. It's 3D polygonal stuff, and I don't know, Mario 64. I don't find these graphics much more primitive or unrefined than, say, like a first-gen N64 games, or even latter-gen N64 games. So, I don't know. I don't want to be heavy-handed about it, but I really feel like there's going to be a lot of games and a lot of good stories you miss out on if you're unable to look past the most obvious sort of technical shortcomings of a game. And I don't think that's exclusive to this game. I think there are a lot of things you could miss out on in that respect. So we're going to fast forward in the story here a little bit later, where Cloud makes his acquaintance yet again with Eris. And what's happened here is he's fallen from a great height, and he's smashed through a church window. And he is not dead and is in fact okay because of the combination of these flowers he's fallen on, as well as the roof he's crashed through. And this further establishes Eris as an important figure and a somewhat miraculous figure, a figure of divinity. And from there, the game essentially revolves around a road film where the characters develop a opposing relationship with the major corporation that's harming the planet, and as well as a figure from Cloud's past that has deeply affected him and made him suffer a great personal loss. However, Cloud is also a very unreliable narrator, so you are also getting into self-trust issues, and as is the case in many sort of Japanese anime medium, looking into an unreliable narrator. Now, why are these things important? Why do they matter? Why is it relevant that the game has sort of a two-pronged antagonist in Cloud's past enemies and demons, and also the immediate corporate entity that they're in constant battle and war with, or what have you, for the sake of saving the environment and such. Why do we need a romance mechanic? Why is Cloud's past necessarily complicated? And what does all this have to do with Final Fantasy VII's place in being a popular or a game that many people feel is important? Final Fantasy VII, these things are complexities, and when I say complexities, I don't mean difficulties. I mean complexities as in intricacies, as in things involved in a video game that very rarely, if ever, took place before this game. This game's influence, as far as telling a more complex story than just good and evil, of just trusting a protagonist, of just saving the princess because that's just what Mario is supposed to do. All of these elements are relatively mature concepts. Now, with games today, while games have always had violence to generate controversy, that form of quote-unquote maturity, Final Fantasy VII in many ways was a game that embraced an adult maturity conceptually. It was willing to give the audience credit to enjoy emotional aspects of storytelling. It was willing to use symbols such as trains. It was willing to use that sort of the train graveyard happening right before a huge populace of underprivileged people were killed. Those are very mature storytelling sophistications, and video games have not historically embraced that or been able to use those sorts of thought exercises and artistic expressions in a way to engage and give credence to the medium and, by extension, their audience. Using if you trace the series back for a comparison point, as much as we want to look at the series or this game in a vacuum, to give it context as to some of its importance. Excuse me. We have the extremely now famous death scene where Eris Gainsborough is killed, and killed in a way that feels extremely permanent, feels extremely unfair and abrupt, and it's sort of taken for granted now that, for instance, at the end of Mass Effect 2 and a decision point in Mass Effect 1, there are various points now where a character dying can happen, but that essentially comes from this game's initial idea of having a character become mortally lost in order to further invest the player and to get the player into an emotional place that more reflects the struggles we have in real life with loss, or with questions about afterlife and questions about human purpose and things like that. That's not necessarily something that games contained before then, and this game did it extremely well. Not only did it do it, but there are a lot of subtle touches that made it much more effectual as well. For instance, the scene where Eris is killed, there is a boss fight directly after it to close out the first of the 3 discs on the game. The large majority, as in most RPGs, or JRPGs anyway, there is a set boss theme. So whenever you fight a boss, a certain music plays because that's the boss theme or whatever. When you fight this boss, the game plays Eris's theme instead. It's extremely subtle, but it's so effective. The game uses music to express this sort of idea of loss and remembrance. Having this theme play after she is killed is extremely emotional because of all the other times this musical theme has played. It played in all these other places where you have memories of Eris, and you have these moments with Eris, and now it's playing during a boss fight, which feels extremely out of place, but appropriate. It's almost like a funeral. There are a lot of really expert touches that this game has just across the board with situations like that. Here we see a scene, for instance, where we've got a playground, a scene where we had seen a playground earlier, this dirty, mucky playground, and a lot of it has been destroyed as a demonstration to sort of give a symbolic way to demonstrate all the children that were killed in the terrorist attack executed by the Shinra Electric Power Company, the major corporation. I wouldn't describe this game. One of the other ways that this game is mature, I think, is there is only one scene, as far as I can think of, that has some sort of direct implication of sexuality. There's a lot of sort of joking sexuality and sex jokes in one particular point, but the sex scene, I believe, with Cloud and Tifa is quite implicit, which is sort of interesting to me, in that the game only sort of tells you what you need to know. It doesn't make the relationship about that because it doesn't have to be, which I think is another expert touch. It definitely shows no sign of fear in going there, so to speak, but it demonstrates a real big maturity. Here we are in the city of the Lost City, the city of ancients, where Eris is killed, and scene transitions throughout the entire game are the same universally. except there, right before Eris dies, there's immediate scene transitions. There's no fade. There's no black. It's very subtle, but if you pay attention, it's there, which creates this sort of feeling in the air of something being off and something being askew, and that comes right before this death scene. So this game is honestly expertly crafted and paced well enough to where you could really talk about it forever. It's quite an epic. An epic. If you had flaws to nitpick with the game, for me, the translation is certainly subpar in places. Um, I think the first of the three discs is much more masterfully done than 2 and 3. Honestly, the game is basically 2 acts, even though it has 3 discs. The last disc just being sort of side quests and sort of putting the bow on the game. And I think the second act has kind of an inability in keeping up with how great the first act managed to be. And again, this is the death scene that you can really. I think this scene is the moment where gaming grew up. Even this game's own series, Final Fantasy IV, has a couple death scenes that are very flippant and they're very afraid to sort of take themselves seriously. So regardless of nostalgia marketing, I don't think you had to be there in 1997 to appreciate the influence that this game has had on gaming after. Graphically dated or not, I think demonstrating that the medium of video games can tell eloquent or complex stories eloquently, can demonstrate important things to us, can make us feel emotional the same way that a film or a book can. Using music, using commentaries on real life issues such as environmentalism, on death and personal loss, on classism, without being heavy handed, without being didactic. Showing that a world can be thought provoking and interesting without having to just force it to be huge. This game just does a lot of things correctly, and I think it's positively masterful. So that's been the latest episode of Let's Study. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a Twitch stream. You are welcome to join me there anytime. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.